The quality of lighting and materials in viewports is controlled through the viewport menus. You'll want to be in default shading mode to get most advantage out of these controls. So you don't want to be in any of these stylized modes, but in default shading. And when you're in default shading mode, you can access the shading menu, which is currently labeled standard, and change up some of the options. The primary difference here is between standard and high quality mode. In standard mode, we've got a kind of very simplistic display. If we switch it over to high quality, it turns on all of the lighting options. And one of those options has to do with progressive skylight display. And in this case, it's actually really kind of slowing down my display. It's trying to calculate shadows from an environment in the background. And high quality mode can have some other issues, so I don't tend to use it. Instead, I use standard mode and set each option individually. So let's go back to standard mode. Then go back into that shading menu to the submenus and choose lighting and shadows, illuminate with scene lights. And we get some lighting in the shot. Let's go back into that menu, which is now labeled User Defined. Also go into Lighting and Shadows and enable Shadows. Once we've done that, it becomes a little bit more clear that, in fact, we're not getting all of the lights. I've got many of these tube lights here, but we're not getting any illumination here in the background. And that's because by default, standard mode only allows us to render 4 lights in the viewport at any one time. If we want to change that, we'll need to go into a dedicated window. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Let's also go back into this menu and enable Lighting and Shadows Ambient Occlusion. But unfortunately, in standard mode, we don't get the ambient occlusion effect here. Ambient occlusion, of course, has to do with contact shadows or darkness in the crevices between objects. To get all of the lights working, and to enable ambient occlusion, we want to go into a window called Per View Presets, or Viewport Settings. Go back into the shading menu labeled User Defined, and choose Per View Presets. The Viewport Settings dialog opens and takes us to the Per View Settings tab. And the most important setting in here is the rendering level. Let's set that to Advanced. And immediately our rendering looks a lot better. In Lighting and Shadows, the Illuminate parameter is set to Scene Lights Unlimited. We also have Shadows and Ambient Occlusion enabled. Well, so we can see the ambient occlusion actually working. Let's set Illuminate back to Default Lights and turn off Shadows, and we are getting an ambient occlusion effect, or contact shadows. We can change the settings for that. Let's increase the ambient occlusion radius to 20 and reduce its intensity to 1. Now we've got a more subtle ambient occlusion effect. Let's re-enable hard shadows and set Illuminate back to Scene Lights, Unlimited Lights. The option I mentioned earlier, Progressive Skylight, causes the illumination from the skylight or environment to cast shadows. And when that's on, the rendering is going to take a lot longer. So that option is helpful if you're illuminating your shot with an HDRI image. But with this traditional lighting setup here, it's not really helping. So we want Progressive Skylight to be off in this case. And then down under Additional Parameters, there's an important setting labeled Material Rendering Level. And this controls whether the materials in the scene are going to render as shaded or realistic. And shaded is kind of the old school material mode. We want to be in realistic mode whenever possible, because not only is that a better quality, but it actually renders more quickly. It gives better performance. We can set the material rendering level to Advanced Material. That is also known as realistic mode. And having done that, if we want now, we can actually save a preset. We've made some changes to this standard mode. Click on the little gear icon and choose Save As. And you will probably be taken to your current user's viewport settings presets. You might choose to save into the current project instead. I'm going to do that. I'll go to my desktop to current project exercise files and save into the render presets folder. Let's give this a file name. We'll call it Viewport Realistic. And click Save. And now that name is listed here. The last thing we want to do is change the display of textures in the viewports. So we'll close this window because to enable textures, we need to do that from the Material Editor or back in the Shading menu here. I can go to the Shading menu, which is again labeled User Defined, and go to Materials. And we do want to make sure that none of the materials in the scene are using the old school shaded mode. So we can just temporarily set this to Shaded Materials without Maps. Then go back into that menu to Materials and set it to Realistic Materials with Maps. And that's the best shading mode available. That's how to control the various viewport options for materials and lighting and save a preset.